Now, picture this. It's 1506 and the Pope, the Vicar of Christ himself, is standing on a battlefield in full armor, personally leading troops to reclaim papal territories. Now, this is not fiction or a novel. Now, this is actually a Pope. This is Pope Julius II, and his story challenges everything that we might assume about what Christian leadership looks like and what it entails. First of all, the question that I'm sure you're going to be asking yourself throughout this video is, was he a man of God or just a warrior, a builder of the church or a political schemer? Now, the truth is far more complex and I think more human than we might have expected. Today, we're diving into the life of one of history's most controversial popes, a man who gave us the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but also earned the nickname the Warrior Pope. To first of all understand Julius, we need to understand the world that he was born into. Giuliano della Rovere, and I'm sorry if I butchered that name, entered the church that was nothing like what we know today. Now, this was 1443, and the papacy was not just a spiritual office. It was a political power struggling for survival in the brutal world of Renaissance Italy. Now, here's what you need to grasp about this era. Italy was not a unified country. It was a patchwork of city-states, duchies, and territories, all fighting for control. We had Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples. Each was essentially its own nation, and they were constantly at war. And right in the middle of this chaos sat the Papal States, territories directly controlled by the Pope. I'm sure you're wondering, why did the Pope control territory in the first place? This goes back to centuries ago. The reasoning was actually spiritual. If the Pope was dependent on kings and emperors for his survival, how could he speak the truth to the power? How could he defend the church's independence? Meaning that the Papal States were meant to give the papacy the freedom to be the church's moral voice without fear of maybe, upsetting a ruler. But by Julius's time, this had become incredibly complicated. Popes were not just spiritual leaders, they were Italian princes who had to play the game of power and politics or watch the church be carved up by neighboring states. Some popes before Julius had been weak, allowing French and Spanish armies to march through Italy at will. Others had been corrupt and more interested in enriching their families than serving God. Giuliano grew up watching all of this, and his uncle, by the way, was Pope Sixtus IV, and he brought him into the church's inner circles, and Giuliano quickly proved himself to be brilliant, sharp-minded, politically astute, and utterly fearless. He became a cardinal at just 28 years old, but here's what shaped him the most. He watched as Pope Alexander VI, from the infamous Borgia family, turned the papacy into something that looked like more of a crime family than Christ's church. Alexander had multiple children, used the church's wealth for his family gain, and seemed to not care about anything concerning spiritual matters. When Alexander passed away in 1503, Giuliano saw his moment. But first there was a brief papacy by Pius III, who lasted only about 26 days. Then on November 1st, 1503, Giuliano della Rovere became Pope Julius II. He was 60 years old at this point, and he had a vision: restore the dignity, power, and glory of the church. The question is, how far will he go to achieve these goals? Julius immediately faced a crisis. The Papal States were in shambles. Various Italian nobles and foreign powers had seized papal territories during the chaos of previous papacies. Cities that should have been under church control were now being ruled by local tyrants. If Julius did not act, the papacy will become irrelevant. It will just become a spiritual figurehead with no real independence. So Julius did something personally, I think, shocking. He led military campaigns personally to take back what he believed belonged to the church. In 1506, he rode at the head of an army to reclaim Bologna, one of the most important cities in the Papal States. Eyewitnesses described seeing the Pope in armor, strategizing with his generals, refusing to back down, even when the fighting got a little bit too close. Now let's pause here because this raises an obvious question. What was a Pope doing on a battlefield? Shouldn't he have been praying somewhere in Rome, for the army? Here's what you need to understand about Julius's mindset and what shape him. To him, this was not a contradiction. He genuinely believed he was defending the church's ability to function independently. Remember, in Renaissance political theory, a ruler who could not defend his territory wasn't really a ruler. He was seen to be a puppet. Now, Julius feared that if he showed any sort of weakness, more powerful rulers like the King of France, the Holy Roman Empire, or the Spanish monarchs would reduce the Pope to their servant. There's actually a fascinating letter that Julius wrote where he explained his thinking, and we sort of peek into his mindset during this moment. He argued that Christ himself had said, "I come not to bring peace, but a sword," and that sometimes defending the truth required defending the church's temporal power. And I'm sure you must be asking yourself, and a lot of philosophers have been, dabbling with this question, was he twisting scripture just to justify warfare? Many of his critics thought so, but Julius truly believed that he was following in the footsteps of Old Testament kings, like, maybe King David. He was a flawed man who God still used to protect his people. Now, the military campaigns worked, at least initially though. Julius reclaimed Bologna, secured other territories, and even formed the Holy League, an alliance with Spain, Venice, and England to drive French forces out of Italy. Now, he succeeded in 1512, though the cost was enormous in both lives and treasure. But here's what's genuinely remarkable. Even while conducting these military campaigns, Julius never lost sight of what he saw as, his ultimate purpose, glorifying God through art and architecture. And this is where we see the full complexity of this man. In 1505, just 2 years into his papacy, Julius made a decision that would change art history forever. He commissioned a young sculptor by the name Michelangelo, who was already sort of famous for his statue of David, to create a magnificent tomb for himself. Now, Michelangelo designed something massive, a 3-story monument with over 40 statues. But then Julius had an even bigger idea. St. Peter's Basilica, the holiest church in Catholicism, was over 1,000 years old at this point and was literally falling apart. Julius decided to tear it all down and build the greatest church the world had ever seen. When his advisors predictably protested, both at the cost and destroying such an ancient structure, Julius was unmovable. He wanted a church that would declare God's glory to the world. He brought in Donato Bramante as architect, and they designed a massive structure with a dome that will dominate Rome's skyline. The foundation stone was laid in 1506, and although Julius will not live to see it being completed, that will obviously take approximately another century, he set in motion what will become one of humanity's most magnificent buildings. And then there's the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Julius had already commissioned Michelangelo for his tomb, but the sculptor and the Pope had a notoriously difficult relationship. They were both stubborn, both passionate, and both of them were convinced that they knew what was best. And so in 1508, Julius essentially forced Michelangelo, who insisted that he was a sculptor and not a painter, to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Michelangelo was furious. He complained constantly, wrote bitter poems about how painting was ruining his body, and even tried to run away from Rome at one point. Now, Julius would not let him quit. The Pope would climb to the scaffolding himself and check on the progress, and the two would argue for hours on end. And once, Michelangelo got so angry that he threatened that he would throw the Pope off the scaffolding. But Julius understood something that Michelangelo, I think at that point, did not even see. This painter/sculptor had a unique vision that could bring scripture to life in a way that no one else could at the moment. Julius pushed, prodded, and would not accept anything less than perfection. When Michelangelo said that the work was done, Julius would climb up himself and point out at areas that needed more work. And now the result, as most of you know, is the most famous ceiling in the world, the creation of Adam, with God reaching out to touch Adam's finger. Now that single image has become one of Christianity's most powerful visual representations. The ceiling tells us the story of creation, the fall of man, and the promise of redemption. Millions have stood beneath it and felt a little bit closer to God because Julius refused to let Michelangelo quit. And there's the spiritual paradox at the heart of it all. Julius could be ruthless, prideful, and worldly, yet he had this genuine passion for making the gospel visible through architecture and buildings. He believed, and this was his theological conviction, that the magnificent art and architecture weren't just luxuries but testimonies to God's glory. When people entered St. Peter's or looked up at the Sistine ceiling, he wanted them to be overwhelmed by God's majesty and grace. And now we need to talk about the elephant in the room. What did Julius not do? He was not a perfect man by any means, because this matters enormously for the church's history. Julius called the Fifth Lateran Council in 1512, just a year before his death. Now, this was a gathering of bishops meant to address problems in the church, and there were serious problems. There were corrupt clergy who bought and sold church offices, priests who neglected their spiritual duties, the selling of indulgences. Now, indulgences are promises of reduced time in purgatory in exchange for money. Julius acknowledged these problems, and the council discussed reforms, but nothing substantial ever happened. Now, you might be wondering, it seems like they had sort of the right mindset and plan to go. What did not happen? Now, this is partly because Julius himself was a part of that system. He used church wealth to fund his military campaigns and building projects. He appointed family members to important positions, what is basically nepotism, which was common at the time, but still deeply corrupt. He could not push for radical reform without implicating himself. Julius saw the problems but lacked either the will or the political ability to fix them. Just 4 years after his death, in 1517, a German monk by the name Martin Luther would nail his 95 theses to a church door, and the Protestant Reformation would begin. Many of Luther's complaints about corruption, about selling of indulgences, about worldly popes were exactly the issues that Julius's council had failed to address. Now, this raises a profound question. What if Julius had spent less energy and time on military campaigns and building projects and spent more time on genuine spiritual reform? Could the Reformation have been avoided? We can't know for certain, but many historians believe that the church's failure to reform itself during Julius's era made the Reformation inevitable. There's painful irony here. Julius genuinely loved the church. Everything he did, the wars, the building, even his personal ambition, he believed that he was serving the church's glory. But by failing to address the spiritual rot within, he helped set the stage for the church's greatest crisis. Pope Julius II passed away on February 21st, 1513, at just the age of 69. He had reigned for less than 10 years, but he had transformed the papacy and left an indelible mark on history. So how do we evaluate him? If we were to grade his character, his papacy, on a scale of 1 to 10, okay? Where does he lie? I think this is where Christian discernment becomes crucial. On one hand, let's acknowledge that Julius gave us treasures that have drawn countless people close to God. The Sistine Chapel ceiling has been called theology in paint. St. Peter's Basilica, though he only started it, remains one of Christianity's most powerful spaces for worship. He restored papal independence at a time when it was genuinely threatened. He was personally brave, intellectually brilliant, and absolutely committed to what he saw as the church's mission. On the flip side, though, Julius embodied many of the world problems that will soon tear the Western Church apart. He lived luxuriously when many clergy were corrupt. He led armies while Christ preached about peace. He built monuments to God's glory using methods that seemed very much about human glory. He had the opportunity to reform the church and largely failed to take it. Julius shows us how someone can be genuinely passionate about God's glory while still being deeply flawed and in some ways possibly missing the point of the gospel. He reminds us that the church is always a mix of divine purpose and human weakness. Scripture tells us in 1 Corinthians that we are earthen vessels carrying God's treasure. Julius was definitely an earthen vessel. He was cracked, perfect, and sometimes contradicting the very treasure he carried. Yet God still used him. The art that draws people to worship, the places that inspired prayer, these were not accidental. God works through imperfect people. He always has. And now, as we come to an end of this video, and we have sort of this reflection segment, what should we be taking away from Julius's story as Christians today? Firstly, I think we should recognize that context matters, but it does not excuse everything. Julius lived in a brutal political environment that shaped his choices, but that does not make all the choices that he made correct. Understanding why someone acts the way that they do does not mean that we approve of everything they did. Secondly, We need to contrast Julius's genuine spiritual vision with his very unspiritual methods. It is possible to want God's glory while pursuing it in worldly ways. And that's, I think, a one for all of us. Do we ever justify questionable means because we tell ourselves that we are serving godly ends? Does the end justify the means? Do we ever let ambition or pride masquerade as zeal for God's house? Thirdly, Julius reminds us that beauty and art do matter. In our modern evangelical culture, we sometimes become suspicious of anything that seems too beautiful or too expensive, but Julius understood something profound. Beauty can be a form of worship and witness. When art and architecture point beyond themselves to God's majesty, they serve the gospel. And finally, Julius shows us the cost of delayed reform. When the church knows there are problems but fails to address them, the consequences can be catastrophic. And this applies in every era, including our very own. Are there issues in our churches, that our denominations, even our own lives that we know need addressing but we keep putting off? Julius's failure should spur us to courage and address them head on. Pope Julius II was called the Warrior Pope, but perhaps I think the better title would be the Paradox Pope, a man of genuine faith and troubling flaws, of spiritual vision and worldly ambition, who gave the church both great gifts and at the same time, may we learn from both. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.